We are excited to be joined today by our Vice President of Conservation Science and Education, Dr. Anna George, because today is a big day for a little fish. So, Anna, some pretty important news happened today in the story of the Snail Darter, which is kind of at this point, an almost 50-year in the making event.
Gosh. Wow. I don't love hearing that it's a 50-year event in the making, but it is. So yeah, all the things you've just said, this is a little fish with a big story. This is in some ways the most famous fish we have here in the Southeast, and that's the snail darter. So this is a fish that really, when I look to do research on the snail darter, if you get on Google Scholar, you're going to find almost as many stories about it from a legal standpoint as you do from a biological standpoint. And that's really where the snail darter has its place here in the Southeast, is this is a fish that tested the Endangered Species Act way back in the 1970s when we first had this groundbreaking environmental legislation. And so what's really exciting is that the snail darter was listed as an endangered species. The Endangered Species Act went all the way to the Supreme Court, challenging various aspects of the legal ruling. And the Endangered Species Act was upheld the entire time. Ultimately, some things went badly for the snail darter, but some things went well for the snail darter. And so here we are 50 years later, celebrating the fact that the snail darter is actually coming off the endangered species list. So it's no longer considered a protected species, and it has recovered. And that's what's really exciting for the news today.
That's an amazing conservation success story. And people who maybe think of the endangered species list as being sort of an endpoint for a lot of species, it's kind of cool to see that it doesn't have to be, that it can be a middle point, that you can go on the list, but that doesn't mean you can't come off.
Yeah, and that's absolutely one of the things we love celebrating about stories like the snail darter. And we don't have enough of them, but we're learning more every day so that we do have more successes like the snail darter. So yeah, for many people, whether you're a conservationist or not, it's often seen that adding a species to the list is a bad thing, a downside. But what I think it means is that we are bringing the full weight of US resources in order to conserve and protect these species. And what that means ultimately is recovery. That is our goal for any species on the list, is that no, they don't stay on the list for forever. We're working to recover them and move them off the list. And so if that can happen for the snail darter, that can happen for many other species too.
What criteria do they consider before saying, okay, this species does warrant federal protection?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, is just to understand how the US Endangered Species Act works, because that's something that not a lot of people know about. And so what this means, we commonly refer to a species being listed. And so that means they have been added as either threatened or endangered, and endangered is a higher level of protection. And it means they're more biologically imperiled. And so they are added to this list. So then what that means, once they decide whether the species merits it or not, they consult biological opinions like ours at the Tennessee Aquarium, like other scientists from universities, other agencies, other nonprofits. They compile all that information, and then they make a decision and they publish it in the Federal Register. And then there's a 90-day time period where people can submit comments, talk about how they feel, submit other alternatives, other opinions. And then they'll publish a final opinion on whether the species has been added to the list, or if they've decided that protection is not warranted at this time. Once the species is added, that means that it really it plays by a different set of rules. And so, of course, we do have environmental legislation that impacts other aspects of what we can and can't do with our land. But a species that's on the Endangered Species Act is really protected. It means we can't harm, harass, pursue, wound, shoot, crap, kill. I can't even remember all the verbs that are included in there, but it's a long list of things that we can't do either as private citizens or as the federal government. And the federal government is where it's really important, because there is a lot of public land. And so the agencies that are tasked with that, managing that public land, have to include management of these endangered species as part of their considerations for how they spend federal money and how they protect federal land. So getting back to our snail darter, the Endangered Species Act was passed in the early 1970s, and the snail darter was discovered in the Little Tennessee River not too long after the Endangered Species Act was passed. And that was part of surveys that were being conducted in the Little Tennessee River, because the construction of Tellico Dam was underway by the Tennessee Valley Authority. And so when they discovered, hey, wait a minute, there's this species here that we had never seen before, it had never been discovered by science in any other river in Tennessee, that's when the wheels of the Endangered Species Act started. And some groups petitioned to have the snail darter listed. The service did determine that the snail darter deserved protection. And so they listed it under the Endangered Species Act. And that meant that TVA could not spend federal money to complete the dam because that would be in violation of the Endangered Species Act. So again, this is really long and complicated. This is the kind of story that when I was taking environmental law classes, when I was doing my graduate degree, we spent several days just studying the snail darter case. It's a really, really pivotal example of the Endangered Species Act. So there was a group of law students at the University of Tennessee who actually petitioned and took this case all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's a very landmark ruling, TVA versus Hill.
In our view, the Congress has, wisely or not, decreed that the endangered species have priority over even a multi-million-dollar dam. In 1966, in the Endangered Species Act, Congress declared that the endangered species were to be protected, in effect, so far as practicable. But in the 1973 Act, which is the statute before us, it very pointedly removed those qualifying provisions and created, as we see it, an absolute duty to preserve all endangered species.
And that upheld the Endangered Species Act and said, no matter how much money TVA has already spent on Tellico Dam, they can't actually complete the project because it would jeopardize the snail darter. It would likely cause the extinction of the snail darter. That went all the way to the Supreme Court. Like I said, Supreme Court upheld the Endangered Species Act. So Congress actually changed the Endangered Species Act, added something that is colloquially known as the God Squad. And that's a group that could override what the Endangered Species Act said and permit the construction of the dam to continue. The God Squad, even after it was formed, said, nope, sorry, the dam still can't be finished. We cannot override the Endangered Species Act. And so Congress finally passed another rider, and that overrid the Endangered Species Act, allowed TVA to complete Tellico Dam. Now that sounds like it's bad news because I just told you that the construction of Tellico Dam would cause the extinction of snail darters. And what was going on throughout all the years that those legal cases were going through is biologists were working to learn more about the snail darter. There was actually some conservation work to transplant the snail darter to other rivers in Tennessee. And throughout that time period, as biologists, including biologists from TVA, were learning more about snail darters and transplanting them, they started establishing in other rivers throughout Tennessee. And that's what we've seen over the past 80s, 90s, 2000s to now, is we saw more and more populations of snail darter popping up, that those transplantations did actually work in establishing the snail darter elsewhere. And so now we've gotten to the point where everyone can say, you know what, we feel pretty secure about the snail darter and its persistence in time. The things that have been done have worked to secure the snail darter.
So that's an interesting story, and that the path to recovery for the snail darter is one that kind of mirrors what we're trying to accomplish with the lake sturgeon. They have a similar set of challenges they've had to overcome.
Yeah, there's a lot we have learned about aquatic conservation because of all that work with the snail darter. So, a few things that you'll notice is that the lake sturgeon, you're going to say, hey, you've also reintroduced lake sturgeon to rivers in Tennessee. And that's absolutely a method that has become more adopted in freshwater conservation. Now, with the snail darter, I want to key in on a difference here. I use the term transplantation, and snail darters were directly moved into rivers that probably did not hold snail darters before. Now, this is science. We don't actually know. There's a lot we will never know, and we think those are rivers that would have been in the range of snail darters, but there had been a lot of collection of fish in other rivers, and snail darters had not popped up in those rivers before, and now they're pretty abundant. So that's a key to us, that perhaps that wasn't really the best form of conservation, in that it's not a reintroduction. It could have been viewed as an introduction. At the same time, it doesn't seem like snail darters are causing any problems to the fish communities there. And like I said, it would have made sense to have had snail darters in those rivers because the habitat is so similar. But that's a pretty key difference. And that's something that you could say we've learned over the past 50 years in freshwater conservation, is that we've learned that we really should use historical data sets to guide where we put fish. And that's what we do with the lake sturgeons. So we go up every year to Wisconsin. We bring back lake sturgeon eggs. Those are hatched and raised until they're at least 6 inches long. But when we release the sturgeon, we try to release them in rivers that we know had lake sturgeon historically. Another really cool story, though, I mentioned a lot was going on for conservation for snail darters, and I mentioned the transplantation. But a big difference also is that TVA changed the way they manage some of the rivers in the Tennessee River system. So they implemented in the 1980s the Reservoir Release Improvement Program. It's a very fancy name, but it means that they started guaranteeing minimum flows of water, and they would oxygenate the water as they would release it from the dams. Because a lot of the times, if you're pulling from a reservoir, you're pulling the dark, cold water at the base of the reservoir, and that water doesn't hold much oxygen. And so if you release water without oxygen, fish need oxygen in the water to respire, just like we need oxygen in the air. So TVA, at great expense, actually started changing the way they released that water from the dams. And because of that, the fish community started to improve, and that includes snail darters as well. So right below Douglas Dam on the French Broad River, there's a really great population of snail darters. In fact, when we release sturgeon there, sometimes I throw on my mask and snorkel and get in the water and go look for those snail darters. So a really important program that was implemented because it helped protect snail darters, but has a ton of other benefits to all sorts of other fish species. And that's also what made lake sturgeon reintroduction possible. So really nice to see how we can manage our environment, that we can have benefits to fish that are on the endangered species list, but that even benefits fish that aren't on the endangered species list, like the lake sturgeon.
One of those sort of touchstone mantras that you all say a lot at the Conservation Institute is that an ounce of preservation is worth a pound of cure. This is a pretty good indication that that is true, that you talk about a 40-year process to get this species off the list. I mean, it's wonderful that it's getting off the list, but I think everyone would agree that it's better for it never to have had to go on the list to begin with.
Absolutely. And Casey, you just showed how much you hang out with us. You're repeating our mantras now, but that is one that we love. We also, we like to think about doctors, that if you see a patient at the beginning of a disease before it's spread too far, you have a lot more treatment options available to you. And that's what we're really trying to do, is try to reverse declines before it gets so far that we're looking at low genetic diversity. We're looking at few populations left and the habitat's all gone. So there's fewer places where we can put them back. That's not what anyone wants. That's a lot of extra money. Whereas if we could work sooner in the process and just nudge things back before it gets too bad, to use another example, we all heard a lot over the past year, let's flatten the curve, let's like try to keep things a little bit better now so that it doesn't get too dangerous later.
As we look back at 48 years of work to get this species off the list, once it's off the list, what do you see the legacy of the snail darter being? Is it just going to become another fish that people forget about, or do you think it's going to have a lasting impact on our understanding of and appreciation for all freshwater fishes?
I don't think there's any way anyone will think about the snail darter, especially here in East Tennessee. That was certainly something that people were really following in the news. Like I said, I took environmental law classes when I was in graduate school. So in St. Louis, Missouri, we were talking about the snail darter in East Tennessee. This is definitely something, if you know anything about the law, you know that it relies on precedent. And that set a huge precedent of how important the environment is and how important protection of species is. So even though, there's always going to be challenges to the Endangered Species Act, there's also very strong support for it from the general public, because you and I have both chosen Zoom backgrounds today of beautiful creeks that we know. I chose South Chickamauga Creek right here in Chattanooga, a place where you can find snail darters today. And yes, it is a small fish, but it also carries a big weight behind it. And that reminder of how important the little things are to us.
Great. Well, I guess go pop a bottle of champagne for the snail darter in recognition of its success, this momentous moment in its history of trying to get off the list. So this is a big day.
This is a big day, and we'll pop a champagne bottle for today, but we've got a lot more work to do tomorrow to get the rest of the southeastern fish off the list. So we'll be at it. Don't worry.
All right, we'll get to work.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Casey. Good talking with you.
Thank you.